This morning, Ivanka Trump and former Senators Chris Dodd and Rick Santorum talked about paid family leave policy. In the first panel, the White House advisor sat down with Adrienne Schweer, a fellow on the Bipartisan Policy Center's Paid Family Leave Task Force. This whole program runs an hour and 50 minutes.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm Julie Anderson. I'm a senior vice president here at the BPC. Also happen to be a working mom with aging parents, so I'm very excited to be kicking off our conversation on paid family leave. Last year, BPC's Early Childhood Initiative, which is led by Senator Rick Santorum and Representative George Miller, issued a package of policy recommendations really aimed at improving the well-being of young children in the country. We were very pleased over the last year to have helped move forward on expanding the child tax credit, reauthorizing the federal home visiting program, and increasing funding for quality child care. But to further help strengthen American families, the pair also recommended that the country really look at adopting a national paid leave program. In 2018, we have started a new effort to really think about and explore what that program could look like. We are pleased to have two members of our Paid Family Leave Task Force here today, Senators Chris Dodd and Senator Santorum. I'm sure they will regale you with stories, but I will just note that they're uniquely suited to help us with this conversation today because 25 years ago, they were on opposite sides of the Family and Medical Leave Act debate. But before we hear from them, I want to introduce our first panel. We are really thrilled to have Ivanka Trump here. She's a senior advisor to the president and a strong advocate for paid family leave. And Adrienne Schweer. Adrienne joined the BPC earlier this year as a fellow focused on paid leave. I have learned over the last 6 or 7 months that she is extensively and extremely passionate about the topic. She's worked on it throughout her entire career, whether it's within the Department of Defense, on the Hill, or outside as an advocate. And I will just note that she, as you might notice, she and her husband are expecting their 4th child. So I think this is her way and their way of demonstrating their personal commitment to the issue and test driving paid leave policies throughout the city. So we're really, really happy to have her here. And we have a really packed program for you this morning. We have 3 panels, so please use your index cards to submit questions up for each panel. And thank you for joining us. And with that, Adrienne, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Julie. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be here. We're excited to have our first set, Ms. Trump here joining us. You are an entrepreneur, an author, a business executive, and in your new role, you are advisor to the president, leading a lot of the work around education and economic empowerment for women and their families. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Americans are struggling to balance the needs of work and family. Many factors contribute to that struggle and the difficulty in finding and affording quality childcare and the need to juggle multiple jobs. Why does paid leave elevate the administration's working families agenda, and why do you think the federal government has a role?
Well, thank you, and thank you for convening this very impressive group of thought leaders, lawmakers, past and present, and engaging in a conversation that's critically important and one that is really starting to achieve much needed momentum. I think that momentum has long existed in the country at large, but momentum is now occurring on the Hill to pass a paid leave policy, and that is exciting. And conversations like this and bipartisan gatherings like this are instrumental in keeping that momentum going and driving solutions. Going back to your question about how this works into our larger working family agenda, the workforce has changed dramatically in recent decades. Women now comprise 47% of the workforce. In the majority of homes with 2 parents, both are working, and those are homes with minor children in them. They're in 40% of American homes women are the primary breadwinners. So the world has shifted, and our policies need to reflect that shift. There is a ton of research to support why paid leave is just good policy. It supports family cohesion, family bonding. It's important for maternal health. It's important for infant health. Sadly, amongst the developed world, we have the highest rate of SIDS of any country, which is really devastating when you think about it, and truly preventable, and why policies such as paid leave and paid parental leave are critical from a health perspective. But also when you think about our future and our future tax revenue base, we have some of the lowest fertility rates in recorded history in this country. And we don't want to go the way of many other developed countries around the world where there aren't enough children to support the social programs that exist. So when we think about working families and we think about how the family structure has evolved, when we think about how the workplace has evolved, when we think about their real need for relief, I'm very proud of a lot of the things we've been able to accomplish this year. A couple of them were done through tax reform. Of course, doubling the standard deduction was very valuable, whether you're a single parent or as a family. The child tax credit is incredibly important, but in addition to the child tax credit, maintaining important credits such as the adoption credit, the earned income tax credit, the child and dependent care tax credit, these important credits that support hardworking American families. Additionally, there was a dependent care credit added as part of tax reform to support those families that are caring for adult dependents, of which we know there are many, and plays into the broader conversation of paid leave and who it should cover. So I think a lot of great accomplishments, including one on parental leave, were enacted as part of tax reform. So Senator Fisher introduced the first ever national credit for employers to incentivize those, especially for their middle to lower income workers, to offer paid family leave at their organization. So while we think that is not expansive enough and will not cover everyone, it's certainly a good start to incentivizing behavior from the private sector, and that's something that's been tremendously valuable. I think when you think about the broader context as well, of the working family agenda, I'm really proud of the fact that in the omnibus, and there were many areas we agreed and were bipartisan, and many areas of disagreement as part of that proposal. But one of the things we pushed really hard was the largest ever expansion of the child care and development block grants that actually go to the states. So it went from $3.8 billion to $5.2 billion. And that will be enormously beneficial to working parents to offset the enormously high cost of childcare. So in roughly 50% of this country, geographically speaking, childcare is now the single largest family expense, even exceeding the cost of housing. So this is unsustainable. It's not good for our children, who oftentimes are forced into less than ideal, less than stimulating circumstances because their parents can't afford better alternatives. It's not good for working families who are dropping out of the workforce because they're unable to adequately provide for their children. So I think thinking about this holistically, thinking about the importance of paid family leave as one component of a broader working family agenda, and supporting the reality of what the modern family looks like by thinking through the costs of childcare and providing working parents the relief they need in the form of credits, whether it's EITC, the doubled child tax credit, or so many others that we've been working so hard on. So I'm excited that we're advancing this conversation, as in many cases it's long overdue. And again, I thank you for having me here to discuss some of these things today.
Thanks. One thing you talked about was opportunity to actually move things on the agenda. And we are living in unprecedented times of political divide. What makes you think that now is the time, or that that the Hill and the administration have an opportunity to forge bipartisan consensus and really consider paid family leave?
Because I'm an optimist. That's the only way you get things done. So the last 17 months, I've spent a lot of time engaging people in dialogue around the merit of paid family leave and why this is good, smart policy that incentivizes the right behavior. We want people to maintain their attachment to the workforce, and we want people to be part of well-bonded families. We want to protect our most vulnerable, our children, our adult dependents. So there are so many arguments for the merit of this policy. And I really spent a lot of time in one-on-one conversations articulating those. And I'm excited because I feel that there is momentum where we're moving beyond the merit to the how. And that's where people will start to rip each other up, and that's life. I've learned that in DC. It's not a city that really rewards compromise. It's easier, politically speaking, to stick to the talking points and not meet in the middle. But I think we are seeing movement. I think the fact that Senate Finance hosted a hearing, Senator Cassidy, on the topic of paid family leave in and of itself is a major step. The fact for the first time in history, the president, a Republican president, put paid family leave and allocation into his budget in both budgets, the first and this most recent one. And the fact that it was mentioned in both the joint address to Congress and this year's State of the Union indicates that this is a priority for the administration. And I think we see lawmakers on both sides of the aisle responding. So is it going to be hard? Absolutely. If it was easy, it would have been done 25 years ago when FMLA was passed. So it is going to be hard. And I am realistic about the time frame, and I'm realistic about the difficulty. But one of the things that I leave every conversation I have with lawmakers, regardless of whether they're Republicans or Democrats, is don't shut down the conversation as it's gaining momentum. Continue to talk about it. Reach out, because while there are many different policies proposed, we need, and if this is actually going to be signed into law. So I'm happy to sit here and talk about the merits of paid leave. And I think as a country, we need to be doing that because that's going to advance the conversation. But for our lawmakers, this is an opportunity to move off the talking points and to engage meaningfully and to engage in discrete conversations where we can see if there's a way to find compromise and if there's a way to craft legislation that will garner the votes, that will actually land it on the president's desk. And I think the time is long overdue for that to happen. But I do believe that we're in the middle of a process that is leading us in that direction.
Thank you. And thank you everybody in the audience who submitted questions. We really appreciate it. We're going to take a couple here, and feel free when you're submitting questions to add your name and your organization. We'd love to acknowledge you and find out where you are. This one does not have a name, but I'm going to read it anyway because it looks great. What feedback are you getting from Republican members of Congress on this idea of paid family leave?
It's evolving, and it depends who you speak to, just like with Democrats. You know, there's various levels of enthusiasm depending where on the spectrum you are, how comprehensive it is, and what the pay for is. And I think that's where we're getting into more substantive dialogue. If we can get to a place where we agree that it's time for paid leave and it's time for the country to pass a national policy, which is what the president's called for, then we can get into a discussion, okay, what's the best way to pay for this? How comprehensive should it be? And that's where both sides will need to meet in the middle and figure out what's viable and also what's sustainable. So I think that education on this topic across the spectrum is positive. I think it makes people a lot more enthusiastic. Actually, today, the focus of this morning's cabinet meeting, which I'm leaving here to head over to, will be workforce development and vocational education, skills training. With such a robust economy, we are particularly focused on bringing people off the sidelines who have been outside of the workforce, who want that opportunity to work and participate in a meaningful way. So I think actually paid leave really plays into that because we're trying to maintain attachment to those already in our workforce and not incentivize them to leave it and not come back or or not create a challenge to their reentry because they have inadequate childcare or because they didn't have job security because they were working at a small business and weren't entitled to even unpaid leave. 1 in 4 mothers in this country returns to work after 10 days because they simply can't afford not to, and they can't risk losing their job. So I do think that the more we educate, the better, and the more we come together discreetly, quietly, and without judgment of various proposals, the better. And so I urge everyone in this room just to keep the dialogue going, maintain an open mind, and evaluate with interest new and fresh ideas that are brought to the table, because that may be the beginning of real forward movement in a bipartisan way.
It's a great point. And we're lucky to be joined today by 2 of our co-chairs, Senator Dodd and Senator Santorum. And as the task force is looking at paid family leave, and as I've looked at it over time, it's been interesting to hear Republicans and Democrats on the Hill kind of coalesce. A few years ago, Republicans were talking mostly about tax credits and savings plans, and today they're talking about an up to 12-week social insurance program for parental leave, and the Democrats have long been talking about a very similar proposal. But looking across the spectrum at what options are out there is very much in the DNA of our task forces and thinking through all the options. So let me get to this other question by someone from our audience. Marjorie Robertson, are you here, Marjorie? Oh, perfect. She asks, many employers provide disability leave for maternity and additional family leave for bonding, and private market insurers sell these benefits. Have you thought about supporting legislative solutions or proposals that encourage private solutions like this?
Well, absolutely. And I think that was one of the elements of tax cuts and tax reform that many people don't yet know about, but is going to be very beneficial. We would love the private sector to do it. I think what we know is for small business, a mandate is incredibly hard. They're struggling to get by as is, and they can't afford to subsidize wages for an employee who's out of the workforce if you run a small operation, have 3 employees, and have to hire somebody to fill that position. So it's actually one of the great arguments for a national program to help our small businesses so that they can compete with the larger businesses who are disproportionately likely to offer a more robust benefit. But I think any type of incentive we can have to the private sector to do it, because they'll probably do it better, and they'll do it more generously, and they'll tailor it more specifically to the needs of their workers, which is great. Different businesses have different workers who value different things. So we are strongly in favor, but I don't view it as mutually exclusive. I don't think it will give, I don't foresee in the near future getting to a place where the private sector takes care of this problem. Unfortunately, what we see today is that only 15% of Americans have access to paid family leave. And when you think about lower income workers, that drops down to 6%. So the people who need it the most are the people who are less likely to have it. And that's what we're looking to solve for and that's where the majority of our energy is focused as we think about a national program.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for submitting your questions. They're great. This one is from Nikki Schwab, and she says, because of the toxic political environment, are you having trouble engaging Democrats? And which Democrats have been most enthusiastic about coming to the table?
It depends which Democrat. So, no, I took a lot of flack once when I said I don't view myself as a political animal, and I really don't. I didn't come down to Washington with that background. I care deeply about policy. That's what motivated me to change course in my life and move to the city and try and advance discussion and ultimately results on issues that I care very deeply about. I care a lot less about the politics of an issue. I care a lot more about bringing people together and trying to find the right solution. And I have really built very rewarding relationships with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who feel the same way. And it took some time. You have to, especially in an environment like this, you have to work to earn trust, and that's appropriate. And I've worked very hard to do that. And I don't want to call out names because actually a lot of the people who have engaged with me in the most substantive way have done so because they know that I'm not going to violate their confidence and share their perspectives publicly. They've given me advice from a strategic perspective on who we can bring over, who's most willing to compromise, who generally is the most thoughtful and dynamic in their thinking, and who gets things done. It's really easy to be in this town and not get things done, and to stick with paid family leave is so important, this is why it's so important, and do nothing. And we're not interested in that. We're interested in getting things done. So I'm interested in finding those lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who share that interest. And when they want to talk about their discussions with me, I'm sure they will. But I've never been one to do that, whether it's at my home, at my office, or oftentimes at their offices or elsewhere on the Hill. I really value the fact that they're willing to engage and roll up their sleeves and work with the administration on issues that they agree with, even if there are others they dramatically disagree with, because that's what it's all about. You know, we have to lean in where we agree, and when we have to stand up where we disagree, and that's good and that's healthy and that's part of the process.
Thank you. I think we only have time for one more question. So this is from Lizzie Naylor. Are you here, Lizzie, somewhere? Over there. Hi, Lizzie. Thank you. She asks, why stop at paid parental leave? Why not include family and medical leave as well, as 75% of FMLA users do not use FMLA for parental leave. They use it for medical or family leave.
I think it's a great question. I think that caregiving leave is very important. I think when we think about a national policy, I'm motivated by what we can get done. So there seems to be the most bipartisan support for parental leave. With that said, I think that the position, my position is that I'm very open-minded to all forms of leave, and maybe that doesn't take the form of a national policy. Maybe that's designed, I mentioned earlier as part of tax reform, that there's a dependent care credit for adult dependents, for families who are caregivers for those. So I think we can be creative in terms of how this is designed. But I agree. I think there are strong arguments and there's tremendous merit to talking about the larger plan. My concern is that we have sat at 0 weeks of paid leave for 25 years. So perfect shouldn't stand in the way of getting something really important and meaningful done for American workers. And ultimately, that will be for lawmakers to decide. What is the best policy? What will they be willing to give on? Where will they be willing to go? And I'm seeking to support that so that we can get something done. But it's a very fair question, and it's an important one to be considering, not just through this discussion, but through all our actions, administrative and legislatively, how we support those providing care for adult dependents. And we know the deep emotional toll that care takes. We also know the incredible financial toll that takes on families. And then there are many families who are sandwiched right in the middle and taking care of children and taking care of adult dependents. So it's enormously taxing and challenging, and it's something we should be coming together to figure out a way to holistically address.
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you everybody for the engaged discussion. We appreciate you being here at BPC. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Really appreciate it. All right, everyone. I encourage you to add additional questions. We're going to call up our second panel as soon as the chair comes on for them to join us. And thank you. And let me hand you these so that I move to the left. All right, let me ask Senator Dodd and Senator Santorum to join us on stage.
Okay.
Morning, gentlemen. Thank you. Senator Dodd, you spent 30 years serving as a U.S. Senator from Connecticut, following time in the House. Senator Santorum, you spent 12 years serving in the Senate, following time in the House as well. We're really excited to have you as co-chairs of the Task Force on Paid Family Leave. One thing we were joking about earlier is that it's not often that the conversation of paid family leave is led with men at the table, let alone co-chaired by a couple men up here. So we're really excited to have some gender diversity to the discussion today.
We have women on the task force.
That is true, that is true. But let me start by asking, gentlemen, you have two very differing political ideologies and backgrounds. Yet over the years, you've worked together in the Senate to forge partnerships that have led to meaningful and lasting legislation. Today, as part of the task force, you're exploring a bipartisan compromise on paid family leave. Will you each tell us a little bit about why you joined the task force and the work that we're doing?
Who do you want to go first?
You, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing
Seniority.
this. Seniority, yeah. First of all, thanks the Bipartisan Policy Commission for hosting this, as you have on so many other issues over the years. So thank you for bringing us together on this subject matter. We'll start there. And the issue of why being involved in it, well, as you point out, I was the author of the Family Medical Leave Act in the Senate, spent 9 years in the Senate to adopt that legislation. Pat Schroeder in the House, who never gets enough credit, was critically important in that legislation as well. I was saying to someone last evening, I remember the bill signing ceremony with President Clinton on February 9th, 1993, the very first act he signed into law as president, did not include Pat Schroeder in the Rose Garden ceremony. So every opportunity I get, I try to mention her again so that people will remember that you don't pass any legislation with one individual. A lot of people were involved, and Pat played a critical role. And it's just been interesting over the years. I started the Children's Caucus in the Senate with Pat Moynihan and Bob Dole. She's not here, but I shouldn't do this with all due respect. I'm glad that Ivanka Trump cares about this issue and is obviously articulate about the subject matter. But I think bipartisanship does get rewarded in Washington. I disagree with the point. I didn't introduce any legislation of any value whatsoever without a Republican partner in 30 years in the Senate. It takes more work, it takes leadership, and children's issues we felt very importantly about this issue, but also all children's issues in terms of focusing on their needs. 1 out of 4 Americans fall into that category. They don't vote, they don't have political action committees, but in a sense, they needed to be represented at the table. And that had a lot to do with the genesis of the Family Medical Leave Act. So Rick and I have worked together, I mentioned earlier, on autism, Lyme disease were a couple of matters we wrote legislation on successfully. In fact, in autism, providing some care for caregivers, given the difficulty that where you are on the spectrum with autism, can be overwhelming for parents and issues, and realize the importance of that, of providing support for people to do that. So it was good to be invited, to be back at this discussion. You get moments in history that provide you an opportunity to do something meaningful. And you need to grab that moment when it occurs. And I'm glad to hear we're at sort of that moment here to expand this idea of being on unpaid leave. And my hope would be, and again, Rick and I will probably disagree on this, but I believe very strongly that medical leave should be a part of that. It's hard to understand why I would exclude that, given the tremendous difficulty that parents face, my colleagues faced in the Senate. I remember making the debate. I had colleagues who did wonderful things on behalf of their families. Remember Jake Garr, my good friend who I saw last week in Utah. We were a very close personal relationship despite differences. Jake gave a kidney to a daughter of his. Spent several weeks not in the Senate. He was applauded, obviously, by his colleagues and others for doing that courageous act for his daughter. And yet he was paid during the entire time. No one thought he was being negligent in his responsibilities as a senator at all. And so I often wonder, we certainly reward behavior where parents can take time with their children, not just at their birth, but also during critical times in their lives medically. And hopefully, again, we'll be able to come to some conclusion. I think the biggest argument we may have will be what Rick and I have already identified, and that is the pay for. I think beyond that, I'm very optimistic about going beyond just parental care. So that's the reason I wanted to be here.
Thank you, sir. Senator?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And it's been a pleasure, it really was a pleasure working with Chris in the United States Senate, the 2 bills we talked about, but other issues that we worked on. And I'm going to take a little issue with Chris just to side with Ivanka, not for partisan purposes, but I think Chris is right in the sense that when we were in the Senate, compromise was in fact rewarded. I'm not sure it is today. And so that's where I would differentiate. I think the political atmosphere has changed in the last 10 or so years, at least since I left the United States Senate. And so I think it is novel that we have an issue that is appearing, that is a controversial issue that conservatives and Republicans would have never seriously thought about a national paid leave policy. As Chris and Adrian both kindly mentioned, I did oppose. I voted against the Family Medical Leave Act. You didn't even know that I voted against it. I mean, so, and I did so because I was concerned about the impact on the business community, particularly the small bit, and setting a precedent. But what I've seen over the past 25 years is a real fundamental shift in what's going on in families in this country and demographics in this country. And we have, I think conservatives are increasingly concerned about the state of, and this is what brings me to the table that maybe differentiates from Chris, is the state of newborns and the enormous amount of medical research that's now out there about the impact of parents not bonding with their children at this very young age and the devastating consequences of that for the long-term health of these children. And while a medical situation is urgent, and I understand the need, the long-term consequences are not necessarily as known as what we do know about the early childhood years. And so I look at it, and Chris is right, the issue is going to be resources. And there is going to be a struggle to get resources devoted to this. And so my input is going to be, we have ample evidence of, number one, the consequences of parents not bonding with their children. We have ample evidence that more and more people of childbearing age are not having children because of the expense and because of the disruption. And we have the lowest birth rates since the Great Depression in this country. And that is consequential to the economy of this country and to the fiscal help, not just in the long term, which I think Ivanka mentioned, which is social service programs like Social Security and Medicare. And I remind everybody, I have 7 children, so I've done my part for that. But most, you're welcome. But most are not because of the tremendous cost associated with it. And so there are ample reasons, given the limited resources that we're going to have, because it's going to be a struggle to get any resources to this program, given the limited resources, to diffuse it over a broader group of people makes it almost inconsequential to their lives. I'd rather take the limited resource we have and focus it on, admittedly, I mean, Chris, and I think Adrian or somebody here mentioned that 75% or something like that of FMLA is used on medical leave. Well, that actually proves my point, that actually a smaller group, more targeted with limited resources, is actually going to have your biggest impact. And one of the things I learned in my final comment, I know I'm going long here, but my final comment is, one of the things that I have always admired about the Democrats, and it's caused me the bane of my existence of my conservative colleagues, is Democrats are willing to take a slice at a time and move on and fight again. Whereas Republicans want everything fixed at once, and if we can't get everything we want, we go no. I think this is an opportunity for Democrats to be Democrats. Take the slice and then fight another day.
Just quickly on this,
Yes,
on this last point, that the numbers I pointed earlier, that plus 70% have taken the Family Medical Leave Act. That's 200 million examples of people taking the Family Medical Leave Act in 25 years. And the vast majority have done so for medical reasons. Sort of makes the case in a way. I mean, obviously, if you're going to have a medical or a parental leave program, what are the larger issues you're grappling with? Good Lord, when children are born, well, Ivanka was right. There's some 25% of women who are going back to work within 10 days of the delivery of a child. The problems that we're seeing with the sandwich generation, I'm a perfect example of this today. I have 2 daughters who are teenagers, and I've got 3 siblings who are not married and are sick. And I'm the primary caregiver, in a sense, financially and otherwise, for them. It is difficult. They're in different locations, trying to provide for them. At the same time, I've got children running about. And so the point is, when you're getting that many problems in an aging generation or an aging population, you can't disregard that in terms of who takes care of people in those circumstances. So, again, my experience has been that when you get the kind of, I think, general agreement that we've now reached a point where paid leave is important, adding the fact that we want medical conditions to also be included, if you don't grab those moments to try to get it done, you can wait another half a generation to deal with it. So my hope is that we won't miss this opportunity. But just a point we can have the same.
Well, one thing I'd add as we're on the topic of FMLA is that 50% of people say that they don't take FMLA because it doesn't have a paid component to it, which is part of the reason that this is driving the conversation. Anybody who's watching online, we ask you to submit questions, #VPC Live. Thank you for everybody who's adding them here. I have one more question for the 2 of you on my own, and then we'll jump to questions here. For generations, people have figured out how to balance work and family. And a lot of the criticism to a paid family leave proposal is that we should be able to figure it out. You should have personal responsibility. What makes you think that now might be the time, or what's driving this national interest for people to be elevating paid family leave as a potential solution that we need to tackle at the federal level?
Well, I think, again, you look at the state of the family today. The state of the family today is not what it was 25 years ago. And now you have a majority of children in America being raised without a father in the home. You have a lot more women in the workforce. I make the argument in large respects because of government policies that are both friendly, and which is a positive thing, but also punitive to families from a tax point of view. I mean, it's just much more expensive to live in America because of the tax burden that American families are dealt with, and so there are all sorts of, and just the whole culture, just a different culture of how when people get married, people are waiting longer and longer to get married, and I just look at it from the standpoint of a society that says, you know, if we're going to continue, we need to have stable families for children to be raised in. We need parents to attach to their children. We need parents to have children. If we're going to continue to be a civilization, one of the big arguments, in fact, one of the most effective arguments that the left has for immigration is that we're not replacing ourselves. And you can't have a growing economy and a vibrant economy with a declining population. It's a very hard thing to do. So there's all sorts of demographic reasons and social science and health science research that really do point to a need to rescue the family situation in America today that did not exist or didn't exist in such stark terms 25 years ago. And I think that's why at least I've found the easiest people to make the argument to on the conservative side of the aisle are faith-based and social conservative type groups, because they see the devastation of the family. They see the devastation that the children being raised and in homes where there's a single mom and she can't connect, and the child's in daycare, and you know, you see all this research about, you know, the importance of bonding, the importance of parents reading and vocabulary with their children, all these things that moms, you know, single moms could do if they were home, but can't do because they're separated. And I think that is a very compelling case that, contrary to the question was asked earlier, why can't the private sector do this? Well, the answer is, I'd love the private sector to do this, but they're not doing it. And the evidence is pretty clear to the private sector. We had a couple of companies here who talked about the success of their programs providing paid family leave. I think the evidence is pretty clear that companies have done this, and you see around the world companies have done this for a long time, that this is a positive thing for companies to do, but they're not doing it. And I appreciate the benefit, the tax benefits that were included in the Omni. I appreciate all those things, but they're not going to get at the nut of the core problem, which is the vast majority of low-income single moms and not having the ability to connect to their children.
Well, again, there's no debate here about whether or not we ought to provide paid leave in a parental setting. I mean, I think that Rick has made a strong point, and I agree with him totally on that. As oftentimes happens, the country's way ahead of Washington on a lot of issues. We have the benefit now of states that are going ahead, not just the ones who have adopted family medical leave, but the ones who are considering it. If you take the ones considering it plus the states who have adopted it, you're getting near half the country. Done at a state level, the laboratories of states, Republicans and Democrats. The state of Washington was a Republican state senator that offered the legislation that created the bipartisan proposal there for family and medical leave, parental leave as well as the medical leave we talked about. And again, now some 6 or 7 states plus this city have adopted those plans. The state of California now more than a decade have had the benefit of how this is working. So we ought to be looking that way, it seems to me. There's a real danger in a sense. I mean, there's wonderful things to say, well, states are doing this, but you end up with a patchwork as well. In some states, there's the shared cost. In other states, it's totally borne by the employers. In others, it's totally borne by the employees. And you're getting patchworks along the way. We really need to have a consistent policy. You have a growing percentage of our population that are the so-called gig employees. That is, they don't work in the traditional settings that we did or people we represented did for years. They're independent contractors, for lack of a better description. They can't rely necessarily on a benevolent employer that wants this. They've got to rely on a national policy that will provide some of those issues as well. I think families are having fewer children today for a lot of different reasons. It isn't just cost. It's choices people are making as well about the size of the families they want to have. So again, I want to be optimistic. I had to be. I wouldn't have spent 9 years trying to get the unpaid leave program passed. And I had great support. When we finally passed the bill, I had over 70 members of the Senate that supported it. My principal co-sponsors all during the process. I don't want to get him in trouble now, but Dan Coates, when he was a senator in those days, was my lead co-sponsor along with Kit Bond and Arlen Specter and Jack Danforth and others. So it really was a bipartisan effort. And that was from the very beginning, by the way. It didn't come to that. We had vetoes and passing it in both houses every time, you may recall. But President Bush was vetoing it. I remember Jim Baker calling when he took over the campaign in August of 1992 and said, "Tell me again why we're opposed to family and medical leave." And I said, "Well, God, I've been asking John Sununu that question for the last 8 years." And so, in a sense, the country's way ready for this. They're already doing it at the state level. We need to catch up. This shouldn't take another 9 years to come around to this. If the debate is about a pay-for, we need to figure out how to do that in a sense that makes the most sense, has the least burden on people, and can be programmatically done without creating new agencies and new departments to do so. So I'm very optimistic about that. Again, having been through the long battle to get us to the point of an unpaid leave program. And with all the shortcomings in it, as I said, some 200 million cases in 25 years have benefited people. We've learned a lot from that. Let's pick up that evidence, if you will, bring it to this new debate. The fact that we've got an administration that cares about this issue on families, I applaud. I wish there were broader consensus on a lot of these other questions involving children and families, but I'll take this as a victory so far. Now we just need to build on it.
This question is from John Rubin, and I'm sorry I can't read part of it, but I'm going to do my very best. People on both sides of the aisle share a common value of empowering hardworking Americans and their families. Why can't we seem to make progress on this topic?
Well, we are. I mean, again, as I think the fact that we're here today, as Rick pointed out, he was opposed to the bill back when he was in the House in those days, but has, like everything else, you have to be able to grow and see the needs that emerge, and I think that's encouraging as well. So I'm more optimistic about it. I heard Ivanka Trump say she was optimistic, and my hope is we can get something done. We've set a timeline for ourselves here to work on this thing. It won't be enough that Rick and I agree, or the Bipartisan Policy Commission. We need to come up with some ideas that a majority of the 535 people in the House and the Senate and the White House will agree on. So it's interesting to start here, but we have to be very mindful through the process that we're not the only audience, the people gathered in this room. And our job will be, in a sense, to design programs and be able to have a healthy, dispassionate conversation, if you will, despite the passion around the issue itself. So I'm very hopeful that can happen.
Great. Senator, I'm going to put this one to you. This is from Stacy Bridges. Are you here somewhere, Stacy? Perfect. Paid family leave goes against the GOP agenda, political agenda. How will we get Republicans to change policy and support paid family and medical leave?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what you do. You can say it goes against the GOP agenda. I mean, there were provisions in the omnibus that the Republicans passed that promoted companies from providing leave. So I think the GOP agenda is very much in favor of families, in favor of healthy children and stable families, and giving people the access to the workplace that's workable for them. So that gets into the structure of what we do and how it's going to be paid for. I mean, let's just deal with the reality that we have huge budget deficits, we have a huge entitlement state, and adding an additional entitlement at this point with, depending on how we pay for it, if we pay for it, is a huge question, and not one that it's probably going to be the most difficult thing that we deal with here. So I think the problem is the implementation, not the desire to actually do something about it. I think there's a great desire to do something. I think it's just a matter of how you would do it.
As we've been talking about paid family leave as part of the task force, we've been thinking about the impact on the private sector and what a national policy would do and the impact specifically on small businesses. I'd love to hear both of your takes, and Senator, a little bit of the history also with FMLA as you were passing it forward in that.
No, it's a great question because it comes up all the time. In fact, Chamber of Commerce folks this morning talking about those issues. And that was a major concern. We had the debate, went on, as I said, many years, but the constant concern was this was going to be a huge burden on particularly smaller employers. And we've collected a lot of data now, and the benefit of that bill, granted unpaid leave, but nonetheless was worthwhile, that in fact the overwhelming majority of businesses, after the implementation of the law, going back and asking whether or not, in fact, those concerns they expressed before the bill passed were borne out to become the fact. And overwhelmingly, including today, the studies that have been done in California, for instance, with the 10 years of paid leave program, you get in the 80% plus positive reaction to how it's working on things like attracting employees, retaining employees, productivity rates. There's an incredibly important list of business that you get with this program. It isn't just a benefit for the children and for the families. Businesses are benefiting from this program and idea. You only get less than 10% of the American people took on a yearly basis the unpaid leave. 90% of the American, they're not anxious to have a reason to be away from work. No one wants to, having that sick child or sick parent or themselves and have to avoid work. And 80% of people, as Rick has pointed out, and I think Ivanka did too, that lower income person that just never took 12 weeks. They'd be lucky to take a week or two if they could. But 12 weeks of unpaid leave would be impossible to do. So I'm more optimistic about this. Again, if you look at the data we're getting now, with the benefit of actually programs in place in diverse areas of our country, then we should benefit from that. Look at that data and information. And it ought to reduce some of the tension and opposition people feel about the benefits of this program, not just for families and children, but for our country as a whole.
Thank you, sir. Senator, did you want to add anything to that
No,
one?
just to pick up on Chris, I just reiterate, I don't think, there certainly are some in the Republican Party who question the benefit of this. I'm not dismissing that. But I think what you're seeing is, and I give, again, the president credit for this, Ivanka credit for this, others of us who have been sort of working this issue a little bit, I think you're seeing a much more receptive understanding among conservatives that this is an issue that we need to deal with. It's all about the how, and it's all about the cost, and the cost and the how have consequences because you have unintended consequences of how you do things, and so that's going to be the sticky wicket here, and I can't, and it's not an easy problem to solve.
I want to underscore the point Rick's making. I never would have passed family medical leave 25 years ago if I didn't have more than half the Republican conference support it in the Senate. So 25 years ago.
You're going to have. I mean, you're going to have. I mean, the way the House, particularly the House operates, you're going to have half the Republicans supporting this. So that's.
It didn't start out that way. I had to convince them.
I understand that.
Ultimately, when it came down to it, after all the hearings and all the debate we had, this was not a partisan issue at that point. And so I don't, in a sense, with all due respect to your question, I'm less worried about that. I think you have to address the questions that are being raised, much as we did 25 years ago, more than that, 35 years ago, in dealing with this. But I'm confident when you get the evidence, particularly what we're getting from the states and localities that are doing this, including things like Montgomery County, a neighbor community, not just states are doing this. So we're getting a lot of very, very valuable information about how this can work and what the costs are associated with a paid program.
With all due respect, FMLA, the experience there is great, but there were no federal resources involved. There were no taxes involved. It is a much, much, much harder climb.
But the arguments were roughly the same. And that is, again, this was too much of a burden on employers on the way.
I don't think that's going to be the issue this time. I really don't.
I'm looking at the chamber over here.
I don't think that's going to be the long pole in the tent.
Well, that's a step forward and helpful.
Well, we only have time for a couple more questions. So this one is from Sophia Giglio. I hope I said your name right. Sophia, are you here somewhere? Hi. We have two dads on stage. Do you see bipartisan support for a policy that would enable all kinds of parents to take leave, not just mothers?
Absolutely. I mean, this is, hopefully the country has come to the point today where we don't have to debate those issues any longer. I know some have different views on the matter, but the country, the courts, and others, loving parents are not based on gender. So absolutely. There was no restriction 25 years ago when we passed the law. There were restrictions imposed by other means, but the law itself did not discriminate in any way. So we were even ahead of the curve back 25 years ago.
Yeah, I don't think there'll be, I would be surprised if the issue comes up that if they try to limit it to just a mother as opposed to a mother and a father. I mean, I don't see that as an issue.
Well, following your panel will be a great discussion with some academic experts who have some really great research and science that backs both of those things up. So I hope everybody sticks around and has a chance to listen to that too. But let me get to one last question while we have it. A significant percentage of families are headed by a female breadwinner. In fact, 40% of American households today are the female is the primary breadwinner. Those households take a bigger financial hit when they take unpaid or underpaid leave. And are you considering this as part of your review with the task force?
Well, I think it's one of the prime motivators for us to do this in the first place is the fact that you have a large number of single household families headed by women, as well as an increasing number of two household families headed by a woman, breadwinners. So that's one of the principal motivating factors for me and coming to the table on this. So yeah, I think that's very important.
Yeah, like I'm sure Rick would add his own anecdotes. I know it's to personalize it to some extent, but I've often been asked, how did I get interested in the subject matter to begin with? I was single without any children at the time, and when I authored the legislation, I went through the process of it. Again, it was an experience at a church, at a mass on Sunday in East Haddam, Connecticut, where there was a woman in church with a child that was terribly disabled, very young. And after Mass, I went up and just started talking to her. And this child, as it turned out, Jacinta, wasn't supposed to live beyond the age of 3. Eva was a single mother trying to raise that child and working, and the difficulty she was having. Jacinta lived to be 23, had the same birthday. Still know Eva. She's remarried and has a growing family. But that experience of seeing what that woman in that little church on Sunday was going through radicalized me, if you want to, on the issue. That this person trying to raise a child with all the difficulties that child had, and that she needed the time to be with that child, but also needed to work in order to provide for the child. And as a society, haven't we reached a point where this shouldn't be a great conflict? And thank the Lord it doesn't happen that often, but when it does, this society of ours in the 21st century ought to be able to say, we're going to help you get over this difficulty, if you will, or to accommodate the need you have for the life of that child along the way. So the history of that comes down to that meeting. That's where it all started for me, and that mass in East Haddam, Connecticut, many, many years ago.
Well, Senators, thank you for your time this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of our task force. We really appreciate it. I hope everybody will stay and engage us as we move through this task force process and kind of come out the other side with recommendations. But thank you for your time. Thanks, sir. Thank you, Rick. And I hope everyone will stay and in your seats for just one moment. Come on up, Kimberly. I'm excited to announce that the second part of our program today is headed by Kimberly Leonard. She is a senior healthcare reporter at the Washington Examiner. She has extensively covered paid family leave. I rely on a lot of her coverage to understand what's going on and see the landscape. So thank you all for being here. Pardon me.
Okay, we're all seated. Everything's set. So the next part of the program, we'll be talking a lot about how families benefit from spending time together and from some of these leave policies. We've talked a lot about the political aspects of this, and we haven't really been able to touch on the science behind why this is valuable to families. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing about that, because I'm often on the Hill reporting the politics and attending hearings and things like that. So it'll be really interesting for me. And we're going to have each of our panelists sort of give a brief introduction and then jump in for questions. And are we also taking questions from the audience? I think that we are. Okay, great. All right, so right here on our panel, I'm just going to move from left to right. We have Myra Jones-Taylor, Chief Policy Officer at 0 to 3. Your organization is devoted to making sure babies have a strong start in life. And then Jennifer Greenfield, a professor at the University of Denver who advocates for paid family leave. And Walter Gilliam, a child psychology and psychiatry professor at Yale. Thank you all for joining us today. Myra, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're working on?
So first, I would love to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting this forum on really what is one of the most important policy issues facing American families today. We have come a long way since the Family Medical Leave Act was passed 25 years ago, from having to make the case, as we heard earlier, make the case for this policy, for actually now having bipartisan policy discussions. So I'm grateful for that. I would like to start off my comments just by sharing the story of the Simmons family, which is a family I got to know back in May at the Strolling Thunder event, which is part of Think Babies, which is 0 to 3's national campaign to get policymakers here in D.C. and in state houses across the country to think babies and enact policies that will, as you said, create strong starts for all children in this country. The family came from Minnesota. It was the Simmons family, Hannah and her husband Marty and her 2 beautiful boys, big blonde hair and blue eye boys, beautiful boys. And they lived just outside of Minnesota, outside of the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Hannah's pregnancy with her second son was uneventful. The delivery was uneventful until about 30 seconds after he was born, and he was struggling to take a breath. And they later found that he had a congenital heart defect and would require open heart surgery the very next day, before he could even turn 24 hours old. Thankfully, Grayson was the boy, he got out of surgery well and he recovered well. But as he improved, Hannah really struggled. She had to manage all of this so quickly. Everything happened so quickly. She couldn't process what was happening. She had to be in 2 places at the same time, be there for her toddler, be there for her infant, and all trying to manage her family. She had just been laid off in a restructuring from her senior management level position 6 weeks before her son was born, and was now trying to grapple with all of these things that were happening. Her husband, Marty, thankfully was able to take leave from his job. He was an agricultural mechanic, but all of that time, he took 4 weeks off, was all unpaid. And so as Grayson continued to improve, she was managing the mounting medical bills. Was she going to get a job? What was that job going to allow her to do? Would it allow her to take care of Grayson and their older son, Dane? And she started to really suffer. And on her 6th-week postpartum visit, she was diagnosed with anxiety and postpartum depression. She reached out for mental health services and was later also diagnosed with PTSD. We know that paid family medical leave would have had a significant positive impact in the lives of the Simmons family. And we know this to be true across the country. When we think about these policies, it's pretty easy to think about the complex needs of all these families, but these are real issues that policymakers can have an impact on right away. They were lucky, the Simmons family was lucky to have savings. But those savings were depleted within weeks. We know that many families are at the edge of financial crisis and need paid family leave, need at least 12 weeks of paid family leave. So we know this is good economically. We know this is very good for the social emotional development of young children. We know that the science tells us very clearly, and this is why 0 to 3 does what we do, that we need to make sure that strong bonds are formed and that attachment happens between parents and babies at the very beginning. I was so happy to hear Senator Santorum talk about that. That is also a long time coming to have Republicans and Democrats, anybody talking about that, so that was great. We know that that needs to happen, and it happens over time, and which is another reason why it's so important to have paid family leave. The other thing I want to stress before passing over to my colleagues here is that we need comprehensive paid family and medical leave. We know that the Simmons family would have benefited not only from time off right after the baby was born, but also to make sure that Grayson had a parent who wasn't stressed out managing, what am I going to do? Am I going to lose my job if I go and take you to your doctor's appointment? We need to make sure that parents have the time and the resources to take care of their children in the event of an illness, of their own illness in the case of Hannah, or a loved one. We have come a long way. This is good news, but we still have to now work out all the dirty, you know, I wouldn't say the dirty, but where all the work happens. It is an exciting time for us here in this country, but as you heard Senator Santorum say, you know, we are facing unprecedented declines in the birth rate. And we know the reason why families, young adults, aren't having children or are having fewer children, they're certainly not having 7, or even 4 as much, God bless you, is because of 2 things: the high cost of childcare and the unavailability of paid family and medical leave. So I'm so happy that we're having this conversation and so happy to be here and share what we're doing on the Hill and across the country to make sure this happens for everyone. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And Jennifer, I understand you have a personal story to share, if you'd be willing to do that with our audience.
Sure. So I also want to echo the thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center for convening this conversation. And it's thrilling to hear Ivanka Trump say, we know that paid family leave is just good policy. And so I'm happy to share my thoughts on it. I'd actually come to the issue because I was studying how caregiving for older adults impacts a caregiver's own ability to save for their retirement, for their own long-term care needs, really impacting not just the short-term household economic security, but long-term economic security as well. And then I suddenly found myself thrust into a caregiving role myself. I was pregnant with twins, and the twins, as they often do, decided to come early. And 2 medically fragile babies in the neonatal intensive care unit, or NICU. Thankfully, through my employer, I had paid leave. The nurses kept telling me all the science that Dr. Gilliam will share about why it was so important for me to be there, holding my babies as many hours as I possibly could to support their health and developmental outcomes. And then I was looking around, getting in conversations with the other moms and realizing they were ducking in for a half hour before running off to work. They were trying desperately to drop off breast milk that they had pumped at work so that their baby would have food for the next few hours while they couldn't be there. They were trying to catch up on sleep because they were managing work and managing these medically fragile infants. And all the while, I knew that their baby's health was being impacted by their absence. And so this made me have a whole new perspective on the issue and realizing that caregiving, 1 in 10 babies in the United States is born early and has some NICU stay. And this is an issue that comes up at that moment of having the newborn, but then extends, and we often have a caregiving episode later in life where we're caring for, the baby with pediatric cancer or the spouse with an issue or an aging parent. And each time there's a hit on our household economic stability. So I started doing research. once you're a researcher, you're always a researcher. So I'm sitting there by the crib side of my kids and thinking up research questions, translated into a study where we're now actually interviewing mothers in 4 hospitals along Colorado's Front Range to understand what access to leave do they have, unpaid or paid, what household income and those kinds of things, and how is that related to their infants' health outcomes and developmental outcomes later on. I'm also continuing the research looking at how caregiving for older adults impacts household economic security as well, and really trying to think of that as a continuum, knowing that this is something that occurs across the life course.
And I understand you have some early findings to share with us, which we can get back to if you'd like.
Okay, great.
So, Professor, tell us a little bit about, I think that when people think about paid family leave and things like that, they don't necessarily think about, all the things that you're working on, at least here in Washington, having to do, with actual childhood development, psychology, and all that. So can you tell us a little bit about some of what you found?
Sure. And I'm glad that we're talking about the babies. because it is about babies too. It's about what's good for parents and it's about what's good for babies, and it's impossible to do what's right for babies without doing what's right for the adults that have an important role in their life. Babies are born hardwired to form strong human connections with someone who's going to be there for them, to be there to protect them, to be there to nurture them. They are hardwired for this. When a baby is born, they have a fairly limited range of vision. They can only see things about 7 to 12 inches away from their face. Anything much closer than 7 inches is too close, too fuzzy. They can't really see it. Anything much farther than about 12 inches, too fuzzy. They can't really see it. 7 to 12 inches, about right here, or about right here. That's 7 to 12 inches. Babies are born with a range of vision designed that this is their world right here. And it takes several weeks for that to actually change. For several weeks in the life of a baby, their whole world is right here. If you were to take a baby, and a newborn baby, 1, 2, 3 days old, and show the baby pictures, and the baby can turn their head to preference one picture or the other. And say, for instance, you had a picture of a face, or you showed the baby a picture of a car. Which way will the baby turn her head? Every time towards the face. What if it's a picture of a face or a Mercedes? Every time towards the face. How about a circle or a square? The circle, because it looks more like a face. They are wired to seek us out. And it stays like that for quite some time because that's what they're designed to do. Babies, when they're born, they know the scent of their mother. You can put a tissue next to one side of them or the other side, one scented with their mother, one scented with a different woman. They'll turn to the one that's scented with their mother. They know the sound of their mother's voice. If they've heard their father's voice in utero, they know the sound of their father's voice. They are hardwired to be connected to us. And in the course of giving birth, we become rewired too to connect back to them, to reciprocate to them. There's a hormone called oxytocin, which some of you may have heard about. It's powerful. It is a hormone that's designed to make you fall in love, to make you fall in love with whoever it is that you see, to cuddle. It spikes up when we form romantic relationships, and it also spikes during childbirth. As a matter of fact, it's so powerful that there's a synthetic version of it, Pitocin, that we use in order to stimulate labor. This is nature's love potion, and it is naturally inside of us, and it spikes up during the birth of a baby, designed specifically to cause you to fall in love with and want to protect that child. And interestingly enough, even though oxytocin levels are different in the brains of men as it is opposed to women, it also spikes in the brain of a man if the man was there to witness the birth. A spike in that oxytocin designed specifically to make him fall in love with whoever it is that he's seeing there, that mother and that baby, and want to be there and want to protect them. This is powerful, powerful stuff. Babies are hardwired to seek out and form human relationships with us, and their skill set is set to where for the next several weeks, for the next several months, they're basically forming those relationships. That's what's incredibly important to the baby, and it's incredibly important to us too, as adults, as parents. You know, whether you believe that it's in there due to evolution or nature or intelligent design, it is in there. And it is in there very hard and very strong. And if anything has taught me about how science is in terms of human development, it's this. Anything that's that hardwired into us, you have to respect. You have to pay attention to it, and when you don't pay attention to it, it has significant ramifications.
When you look at the policies around paid family leave, they often focus on that 12-week period. What do we know about that for parents and for their infants? What does the research tell us, or any of you can answer that? Yeah.
I'm glad to jump back in, but I just spoke. But I mean, one of the things that we know is that, and this is also based on a consensus report from a report called Caring for Our Children, which was a consensus report of pediatricians and child psychologists and developmentalists, that the first 3 months of life is very important for babies for a lot of other reasons too. It's a time when they're learning a lot of really important things, like how to maintain their body temperature. For 9 months, they've had that maintained for them by someone else. And now they have to learn, how do I maintain my body temperature? How do I manage sleep-wake cycles? And that's an important set of work for them to do for the first 3 months. And it's also important for them to be able to develop their immune system so that they can actually be in more public kinds of settings, which is why that consensus report says that it's really not safe for that baby to be in child care outside of the home for the first 3 months of life. You know, and so the first 3 months of life, that's a sacred time. It's a sacred time in terms of that baby being able to learn how to be a human outside of the utero, and it's an important time for that baby and for that parent to learn how to be in a solid relationship.
And I do want to say, too, that the 12-week mark is actually more of a compromise, and there are a number of countries around the world that offer a much longer leave, and we have some good evidence from those places that show that the longer leave actually does have positive health outcomes for both the babies and the parents. The other thing about having a longer leave is that it allows even more time for the parents to share responsibility to both learn how to be caregivers for those newborns. And then lastly, we know that there are a number of companies around the country that are already innovating in that area in the United States and extending leave 16 weeks or even 6 months and beyond. And we are seeing that that kind of a length of time does have benefits in reducing healthcare costs, in improving outcomes for the babies and the moms, addressing things like postpartum depression and anxiety, which sometimes don't manifest until a little bit later than that three-month mark. And then again, getting back to the NICU issue, that we do have so many babies that end up hospitalized for a period of time. One of my research partners actually emailed me yesterday. She had had a conversation with one of the moms we're interviewing and thought that the quote was really helpful. The mother was really grateful to her employer because the employer was allowing her to work at the hospital so that she could save her leave for when the baby came home. And so this is a mom who just gave birth to a medically fragile preterm infant. She's recovering from that birth experience herself, and there she is with her laptop, right? And incredibly grateful that she could do that because then she'll still have time for those first, regular full-term months at home that we, have a lot of science about that say that are so important. She also was grateful because she's going to be allowed to borrow her vacation time for next year. So borrow it ahead of time in order to add on a couple more weeks. What happens when the baby starts at daycare and gets sick? Which happens, right? And so, these are the issues that families are encountering. And, I want to argue that 12-week mark is really kind of a minimum, and that we, ideally, I would hope that we would be talking about an even longer time.
And I would add, we heard from Ivanka Trump saying that 25%, and then later Senator Dodd, 25% of American women right now are going back after 10 days after the birth. Where are they taking those children? Where are they taking their babies? Most states have regulations that will say that the youngest age of a child who can enter childcare, a licensed childcare, is 6 weeks. So this means that either that child is being there's cobbled together care, which is not great for attachment. That whole 7 to 12 range is really important to be consistent. 7 to 12 inch range is consistent care, the same few faces. You don't want to have multiple faces. We also know that unfortunately, if a caregiver is providing care for a child at 10 to 12 days, 10 to 14 days, that is most likely unregulated care because there's not a state that will regulate that. So we don't know about the quality of that care. So while I agree that 12 weeks has really been a compromise, we know that children are entering care very young, and the quality of that care is all over the map, and I would say it's mainly placed in the side of the map that's not that high quality. So it's really a problem.
Now, a few states do have mandated paid family leave through payroll taxes, and I believe that you've done some studies on that too. What have we been able to learn kind of from these state innovative approaches and how they would apply across the country? And there is a bill in Congress that has Democratic support that would kind of create a national plan, but right now they don't quite have the votes for it, it seemed from the hearing that I attended last week. What can you tell us about what we've learned from these state policies?
I could talk about it from the child perspective, in that we know that when states have instituted paid family leave, there are higher rates of breastfeeding, for example. So we know in New Jersey, families, low-income women actually, who took advantage of the state paid family leave were more likely to remain breastfeeding, to breastfeed for a month longer than their counterparts who did not take advantage of paid family leave. That's huge. We know that breastfeeding is a critical component of the mother's healthy recovery. It's also a critical component of healthy attachment, and then it has lifelong positive health benefits. We also know that there have been some studies that show that families who take advantage of paid family leave, the children are actually less likely to have disruptive behaviors and show signs of, actually it's the reverse, and I'm looking at the two researchers here, so I'm thinking, oh, I got to get this right. It's the reverse.
We'll correct you.
I know you will. I know you will, Walter. It's actually so for families that have not had access to paid family leave, there's been one study at least that shows that children they exhibit behavior problems and lower reading abilities by the time they're age 3 or 4. So that's the reverse. But the states that are doing well, positive health benefits. We also see more attachment to the workforce, again, for mothers, lower signs of, lessened signs of postpartum disorder. So there's some good things that are coming out of states.
Right. And a lot of these states also provide the medical leave side, which we can talk about a little bit. Jennifer, with your research, dealing with caregiving, because a lot of times it's caring for a parent, another family member, a spouse maybe, oneself even. But I know that you have done research in the area of looking at care for older adults. Are you able to shed some light on some of these state policies in that area?
Sure. So, one of the things that we know even from the FMLA policy is that 55% of people who took FMLA did so to care for their own medical issue, and then almost equal parts took FMLA to care for a newborn or bond with an adopted child, or to do caregiving for a significant family member who is older than a newborn. And we know that in states where they offer paid leave, for instance in California, which has the longest running paid leave program at the state level, that there is a really significant positive impact in terms of workforce attachment, both for those who took that bonding parenting leave and for those who did the caring type of leave. And so they're more likely to return to work. They're more likely to have higher wages 9 or 12 months later, and that has really significant ripple effects for that family down the road. And so if they know they can come back to work, they know that they're going to have the wages that they need down the road to be able to support their family. They're contributing to their retirement savings, Social Security or others. But the other thing about that is that they have stronger loyalty to their employers. So it's not just that they're going to be in the workforce, but they actually are more likely to return to that employer. And so the businesses have reported that paid leave has either a positive impact on their business or a net neutral effect on their business. There's no negative impact because they're reducing their turnover costs. They're not having to rehire workers, train workers, and they're also seeing increased productivity from those workers because there's less absenteeism, but there's also less what they call presenteeism, which is where you're at work but you're distracted. We all know what it's like to get stuck on hold with an insurance company, or trying to juggle managing the care of your loved one. And so there's less of that going on because the workers are able to take that paid leave. So employers really do benefit from it as well, and there's overwhelming evidence of that from the state level policies.
Now, because it's done through the payroll tax, do a lot of employers tend to hire someone to fill that time, do we know?
You know, it's interesting. I've testified on this issue at the Colorado legislature, and often there are businesses there that testify about it as well. And what they are reporting is that there's actually a number of different strategies that they can use. And one of the reasons that it helps to have a policy that's kind of spread broadly, where there's a broad risk pool, is that employers don't have to pay a ton of money into it, which means that they have a little bit of money left aside so that they're not paying the salary of the workers taking leave, and they're able to pay a salary for a replacement employee, or they can pay for overtime or time compensation for people at that workplace who just fill in rather than hiring a temp.
Right. Now, obviously, during this time off with a new child, a lot of the time can probably be used to see what will happen next in terms of childcare, or whether they're going to switch off to doing paternal leave or something like that. Walter, can you speak a little bit to that, to the use of leave in preparing for that capacity and the change?
Well, we would certainly hope that the time that a parent is able to spend with their child after the birth of the child is going to be time well spent, and that parent is going to be able to devote attention and love and care to that baby, and then be able to form that strong relationship. But there's a lot of other things, like you're mentioning, that also have to happen. If they're going to go back to work, like you're saying, Dr. Greenfield, they're going to have to have a child care arrangement in place, and that child care arrangement could be a child care center, it could be family, friends, and neighbor, it could be something, but they have to have that already planned out, and that'll take a little bit of time too. And then what we would really hope is that we would hope that that's not going to be an abrupt kind of transition, that the parent isn't going to be with their child for 12 weeks, and then all of a sudden they just go to some provider someplace and then drop their baby off. I mean, what would be ideal would be for this parent to be able to form a strong relationship with their baby, and then during the course of that time, have a sense of where this next paid provider is going to be, and then be able to use that time to actually facilitate a warm transition over to that baby, to that provider. When you have a newborn baby, and say I have a baby here, and we see the stranger, and then the baby sees the stranger, what does the baby do immediately? Baby turns to the caregiver, turns to mom, turns to dad. What kind of expression do I have on my face when I'm looking at you? And that's how that baby knows whether that person's safe. If the baby's first experience with that caregiver is going to be at a day when the parent and that caregiver have never met before, and mom is scared to death because this is going to be the first time I'm going to drop my baby off with somebody that I don't really know very well, that's not going to be a good transition. It's not going to be good for the baby. It's not going to be good for anybody. And so what I would really hope is that it's going to be time well spent, and perhaps even taking advantage of things like child care resource and referral agencies that already exist in our country, and they're basically there in order to provide child care assistance and to provide information for parents. And we could certainly make child care resource and referral agencies, I would think, a major partner in family leave in order to be able to help parents be able to use those weeks and months that they would have with their baby to best advantage.
Myra, is there anything that states or the federal government can do, or maybe there are bills that we're unaware of, that would improve support for child care, early education, that we need to be thinking about or watching out for?
Well, we had a historic win when it comes to child care this year with the historic increase in the Child Care Development Block Grant, which Ivanka Trump spoke about earlier today. That is huge. That is the, as we heard, that is the subsidy, that is the resources that states can give to parents to offset the incredibly high cost of child care. But it's also something that CCDBG is also used to improve quality. So there is also an infant toddler set aside, which is really important because we know, unfortunately, there is a dearth of care for infants and toddlers. In the state where I was formerly the Commissioner of Early Childhood, the state of Connecticut, we had one licensed child care spot for every 9 infants and toddlers who needed them. So when we're talking about the paid family leave, we really see child care as paid family leave, child care as part of a continuum of services and policies that we want for families. Also, Early Head Start is a phenomenal, high-quality child care program, high-quality care for young children, comprehensive wraparound care for young children. We also got a nice increase there. So there are things that are moving. It's really important to know there good things did come out of this omnibus. So that was really great news. But we are still not all the way there. We know that still the lion's share of families who are eligible for child care and development block grant, for example, are still not receiving that care, especially infants and toddlers. We know that the lion's share of children who are eligible for early Head Start will never get it with this funding. And so we have made strides, but we are very far away. And so at a time when in our country we can afford a significant tax cut for many people, people who make incomes like myself and much higher, I would hope that we could also find the resources to provide resources that are truly, truly going to make a difference and a positive impact for every family in this country.
Do we have any audience questions? If y'all can feel free to bring them up, but I have more questions, of course. Both of you have studied race disparities and how it's affected this area. I'd like to hear a little bit about some of what you've found, in particular, in regards to some of the differences that you see, whether in certain states or regions and places like that.
So one thing, I was thrilled to hear Ivanka Trump talk about how while 15% of workers across the U.S. have access to some kind of paid leave, it's only 6% when we look at the lower income spectrum. And unfortunately, those who are most likely to experience a preterm birth, for instance, are African Americans are twice as likely to experience preterm birth or low birth weight birth than a white mom, for instance. Are then less likely to have access to paid leave. And so it compounds an existing health disparity when then the mom doesn't have the ability to take the time off of work. We've just been trying to crunch numbers with our pilot data from my NICU study, and unfortunately what we're finding is our median for number of days of paid leave for the moms in our study is currently 0, which means that more than 50% of moms in our study have no paid leave at all. And it's less than 25% that have 30 days or more. And so access to leave is something that is becoming, unfortunately, it's fairly common experience, but it's far more likely among the households that really need that income replacement the most. And it's also far more likely among those who are already historically marginalized and underserved by our healthcare system.
And not to mention maternal mortality rates, which is another issue that Congress is addressing now. When it comes down to what's being talked about on Capitol Hill, I understand the House is going to start talking about it too, and they at least want to start tracking what exactly is behind such high maternal mortality, and it's probably something that they'll end up finding is a contributing factor.
Well, actually, there is research that shows that there is a significant decline as well in infant mortality when you have paid family leave options for families. And we know, of course, that as Ivanka Trump mentioned, that we are the only industrialized nation that has an increase in SIDS. We are also have the unfortunate distinction of being an industrialized nation that is seeing the increase of infant mortality and maternal mortality, and that's disproportionately represented among women of color, African American women. And so when we talk about these disparities, making sure that we have paid family leave that is for women of all socioeconomic levels and racial backgrounds.
And this was actually going to be my next question, so whoever wrote it, thank you. What do we know about the importance of paternity leave or father-infant connection? If a dad has time to be, sorry, whoever wrote this. Are there health impacts if a dad has time to be there after birth? Who can address that question? You sort of talked about that a little at the beginning.
Yes, everybody's looking to the man on the stage. Fathers are important. And I think that's something that most every American can agree on. Fathers are important, and it's important to have a strong father in the life of a child if such a person is available. It's also important to have anyone who's going to be part of that nuclear family that's there to be able to have that kind of a strong relationship. I'm sitting here answering a question about father involvement, and I'm facing straight in that direction, where I've been watching a father hold his child's hand the entire time that we've been sitting here on the stage. And so I'm sitting here answering this question with like a clear visual inspiration right in front of me. So thank you both for that. We do know that when a father can be around with the newborn baby and with the mom, that it helps to form a stronger relationship between that father and that child, but also that father and that mother. And that relationship is going to be an important one, and it's going to be a lasting one. And so anything that we can potentially do through government, through business, through any other private means, that helps to strengthen that little family unit between those caring adults, male or female, and that baby is going to be good for the family, and it's going to be good for society, and it's going to be good for all of us. That's pretty much what the science tells us.
So I wanted to share two things, one of which is that the current study that my team is doing in NICUs is only interviewing mothers for purposes of sorting out confounding issues. But we have just completed a review of literature on parental engagement in infants in the NICU, and there are several studies that look at impacts of fathers engaged in NICU infant care and show that there are decreased levels of depression, anxiety, and all, many of those mental health benefits that mothers have, fathers also experience when they're able to be present in the NICU. The other thing I want to say is that this is actually a really under-researched area, and I think that we need to be putting some resources into understanding this better. I know that in other parts of the world, here we're struggling to put in place any kind of paid leave program. In other parts of the world, what they're trying to figure out is what's the right balance. How do we incentivize fathers to take the leave that they're allocated in places where it's left up to the couple to decide? Often it ends up being the moms who take the leave. And then this results in income disparities down the road for those mothers. And so figuring out how to create the right balance, whether it's mandating that dads have to take some of the leave and moms have to take some, or should they be taking leave together at some point? Those are the questions that they're experimenting with in other parts of the country, and I'm really looking forward to those answers.
Do we have any data on how often men take parental leave, or how many companies offer it, or any of that?
So in California, the paid leave program resulted in more dads taking leave, and this was one of the really important outcomes. And they weren't sure whether that would be true, but when paid leave is available, dads are far more likely to take advantage of it. So I think that that's one of the strong arguments for making any kind of national paid leave program that we adopt available to both both partners if there are two partners in the household.
It's a great point, because when it's not available to fathers, the number will be zero.
That's right.
Absolutely. But I'd like to add one other thing to what you were saying before, when you were saying that, while we're still struggling in America to try to figure out how to make paid leave happen, other countries are figuring out, the details of it. I would say that there's another thing, too, in some of the work that I've been doing in other countries, too, that's happening in other countries. Other countries are also spending their time wondering what's wrong with America that it doesn't already have this, And so when I go to the other countries and I talk about, some of the issues regarding infant care with really young children, they say that's a concern, because in China, we get to be with our babies for the first 100 days paid, and then we can have extended time over and above that. And so I would add that a lot of the other things that countries are worrying about other than the United States is what's up with us.
Well, I was thinking as well that with same-sex couples, if that's not an available option, then how do they work that out as well? So it can probably be discriminatory in that way. And then that also kind of leads into, I guess, this next question about adoption, a topic very interesting to me. My father was adopted. And what does the science say about the time adoptive parents and kids need to acclimate?
I honestly, I'm going to look to you. I don't know. I can say this, though, that we know that families who take leave after an adoption form strong attachments, form strong bonds with their babies in the same way that a biologically a biological child would. I was raised by my stepfather, and he was the most important person in my life. So I would say, you know, the same thing happens, but I don't know if you want to speak more scientifically than that, Walter.
I don't know how scientifically this is going to be, but I mean, one of the things that we just know just in general, whether you're talking about biological birth, whether you're talking about adoption, foster caring, whatever it is, when you're bringing a new person into your family, that's an important time. And it takes time to be able to negotiate exactly what does this mean, how do we understand each other, how do I regard you, for you to be able to form a strong connection with me, for me to be able to form a strong connection with you too, and that's based on trust. And that trust takes some time to establish. And that's going to be the case if that baby is born biologically into the family, if that baby is adopted into the family, if that baby is foster cared into the family, because in the end, regardless of how that baby arrives to us or how that young child arrives to us, it's all about forming human connections.
The other thing I'll say is that babies or children who are adopted, especially if they're adopted at later ages, are often coming from a background that involves some kind of trauma or neglect. And in those situations, it's critically important for that trust to be formed with the primary caregiver. And that's something that requires time. It requires face time. And then once trust is established, that is often actually one of the most challenging times, because then the child is finally free to actually misbehave, to test boundaries, to do all of those things that kids do. And it's really important for the primary caregivers to be there for that part as well, and to not be at that point off at work now, just when the child has grown comfortable. And so it's critically important for adoptive parents to have that time to build those relationships, to weather the first few storms with their child, to develop that deep bond that will help them carry through. And there was something else I was going to say, and it's gone out of my head, so I'll wait.
Maybe what else you were going to say was that the other thing, too, is we don't want to disincentivize adoption.
Right.
You know, so I mean, why would we want to be able to have a policy that's in place for you to be able to form a strong relationship to your child if your child is born biologically into you, but we're going to disincentivize you if you adopt?
Right.
You know, and so adoption is very important. It's important for us to be able to give all of our children, especially those children who have gone through lots of trauma, some kind of a stable home environment, and we want to incentivize it, not disincentivize it.
And you actually reminded me what I was going to say also. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. There's logistics that have to be managed. I have a colleague at DU who recently got the call, there's a baby on the way, and you have to drop everything. You can plan to adopt for a long time, but you never know exactly when it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, and I've had a number of friends, or people that I work with in volunteer settings as well, who suddenly are taking in an infant or two or an older child, and they don't have the clothes they need, they don't have a crib, they don't have all the infrastructure that kids require. And so parents often need that time to be able to make the phone calls, set up those doctor visits, set up all of the stuff that comes along with having a new kid.
Right. Myra, were you going to add something on that? No. Okay. One of the questions we have here, and something that we talked about a little bit on our phone call, has to do with childhood illnesses after paid family leave. One of the things I have covered a lot as well in my capacity as a reporter, just all of the appointments that parents have to get done as soon as they have a baby, whether it's vaccinations or checkups. And they happen, so many times over the course of the year after birth, and then over the course of their lives, of course. Can you talk about some of the ways that paid family leave policy can help improve wellness for a child in terms of doctor visits or, better health outcomes then as a result?
So we know that, babies between, I think it's the first 3 years, have more than a dozen well baby visits. That's just to make sure that the babies are getting vaccinated, that they're getting the support that they need to be on a healthy trajectory. We also know, unfortunately, that there are children who suffer significant, major childhood illnesses. we know that childhood cancer, for example, is on the rise. Over the last 20 years, there has been a steady increase in childhood cancer, and those are concentrated in early childhood. And the severe, really intensive forms of cancer are often experienced by children before the age of 1. It is critical that a parent be able to take time off to be with a child who is going through really horrific medical treatments. And for the parent to be able to feel that they are doing their job as a parent, to care for a child at their greatest hours of need. And so we know that while it's really important to have this time, to have paid family leave happen at the beginning of a child's birth, we also want to make sure that it is available later on in life for those horrible and unforeseen situations. We know, for example, we don't want to have a disparity between co-workers who are working side by side, where you have a parent who's been able to take off with a joyous occasion of a new birth or adoption, and then have a coworker who's just down the hall or in the next cubicle who has a child who is suffering from cancer and cannot take off to be with that child and is rushing straight from work to the hospital to be with the baby, or taking off unpaid time that is going to have a significant economic impact on that family. So we know that it's important across the life trajectory. I haven't even spoken about elder care. Ivanka spoke about, being that sandwich generation. That is also a critical component of just being able to be an American, a human being in society, and care for families across the lifespan.
And I think it's important to recognize that in situations where a child has just been diagnosed with cancer, or there's some kind of life-threatening health issue, that not taking time off work is actually not a possible choice. I had the experience of taking a kid who was sick to the doctor. The doctor did the pulse ox, said, your kid needs oxygen and you're getting in an ambulance right now, and going to Children's Hospital. Yeah. And at that point, we get in the hospital, and the kid was 15 months old. It was not possible for me to leave him. It's not the nurse's job to do childcare. And so at that point, the choice is, am I going to keep my job, or is my employer going to fire me? It's not, am I going to stay or not? My nephew had pediatric cancer just in the fall, and there was no choice. His mother, of course, had to take time off to take him to chemo, to take him to radiation. And so what happens is that the caregiver, whoever is chosen in the family, does lose the job if the employer doesn't provide the paid time off. And so we see stories of this happen all the time. And it's one of those things that happens somewhat at random. And so, caregiving just lands in our laps sometimes. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why a comprehensive paid leave program can have such broad bipartisan support, because there are so many people in this country who relate to the issue, who can say, oh, we just went through that with my mom. Oh, my husband just, whatever. And there's so many stories like that. When I talk about the work that I do, invariably that's what happens in the coffee shop, when I'm getting my hair cut, et cetera. People say, oh yeah, we just had this happen in my family. And so I think that this is why we can have this kind of broad bipartisan conversation now. Mm-hmm. People are experiencing it. We know that when faced with a choice of losing a job or losing a family member, we're never going to choose to lose the family member. And so there's an economic cost that many families are facing, and I think that that's what we need to address as a country. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And on this topic of health, we can even circle right back again to breastfeeding. Having well baby pediatric visits and vaccinations on time, those are good things in terms of helping to keep babies healthy, and so is breastfeeding. I mean, breastfeeding is nutritionally the right thing for babies to be getting, and it also gives them antibodies that are designed specifically to keep them healthy. Breastfed babies are more healthy, and they're less prone to illnesses and sickness. And so by giving families this time for these well baby visits and also time for breastfeeding, you're getting a double hit on this of goodness.
Mm-hmm. And saving healthcare costs in the process.
Absolutely.
I guess kind of to wrap this up then, because you were just talking about what policies we should support and there being bipartisan support and all that, and there is There is there are some proposals kind of making their way through Congress, one of which would allow new parents to draw from their Social Security fund and then delay retirement. Another that we talked about, the Family Act, which works in a similar way as California. Do each of you, kind of as a final question, if you had a specific policy where you would say this is nationally what the next step should be, what would that look like?
I will say I'm very sensitive to something Senator Dodd said, and I appreciated Senator Santorum saying it in a very positive and a kind way, saying that, you know, Democrats take one slice of the apple and they'll come back and take another one. But I think we've taken the slice with paid family leave, and this is the chance to get the whole apple, if you will. We've had, you know, 34 years, if you count when Senator Dodd started this. We have made a significant movement on this, and it's wonderful to see them appear together. I really think that we have to have a comprehensive paid family leave. Again, the statistics, I'll just say them again, we know that over 70% of Americans who take advantage of Family Medical Leave Act take it for medical leave. We don't want to leave those families out. We don't want to leave that type of caregiving outside of the equation. And we also still, of course, need to make sure that babies and parents have time to bond with each other. I will leave it to my esteemed colleague, Jennifer, to speak to the Social Security issue. I will say this one thing, though. We do know that Social Security is women and women of color, low-wage working women are often get the short end of the stick when it comes to Social Security. And so I would be very hesitant to advocate for anything that is going to increase those odds or make those odds worse for families and women in particular.
Exactly. Yeah, I just want to echo that I would have serious concerns about tapping into Social Security, either by having people delay when they can take their retirement or by reducing the benefit that they would receive in other ways, because the people who need this paid leave the most are the ones who are most likely to also be relying heavily on Social Security down the road, and are also the ones who are most likely to need to retire earlier rather than later. They're not going to be those who are taking advantage of their higher benefits if you retire when you're 70. They're the folks who are waiting, counting the days until they can finally file for Social Security at 62, 63, 64. And so,
laborsome jobs.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. They're physically grueling jobs. These are folks who have already experienced health disparities across their lives. And so then to ask them to wait because they took time to care for other people in their family who needed the care, it doesn't make sense to me. The other thing is that we have a growing number of households that are not fully prepared for their retirement, who rely exclusively or almost exclusively on Social Security as their main form of retirement income. Right. And we are living longer, right? And so we're living on that for many more years. And so if anything, we need to be shoring that up and making sure that we all have proper retirement preparation, not thinking about ways to reduce it. One of the things that we know about humans is that unfortunately we're really bad at forecasting our long-term needs. And so we don't do a good job. And I will just say anecdotally, when I was put on hospital bed rest with my twins, I started, as you do, you just read through everything on the internet, and get terrible advice. And so I clicked on this article that said how to afford your twins. And the first bit of advice, I was desperate. The first bit of advice was stop your retirement contributions at work. And as somebody who had researched it, of course, I threw my computer across the room. But this is the advice that people are giving, and unfortunately this is a financial reality that many households face, that whatever money they are putting into savings is something they need to pull back and use for immediate household expenses. And so asking them to also, at that moment in time, hurt their retirement contributions through Social Security is a really bad idea.
Okay. And I should mention the bill hasn't been introduced yet, but I have been told by Senate aides that it is going to be pretty much that idea. So we'll see once it comes out.
I'm a little worried about it too. I share all of your concerns. I mean, when I sort of sit back, and I appreciated what you said about our collective difficulties forecasting what we're going to need in the future. You know, when I sit back and I just sort of think about the whole idea of funding it through borrowing from one's own Social Security, it sounds a little bit like a predatory lending scheme. You know, it's just like payday lending. You know, and I don't know if that's going to be a wise. I can appreciate the desire to reduce and to delay Social Security payments, and I can understand that there's a fiscal pressure that's regarding that. But to sort of balance that off at the expense of babies and parents, I mean, I'm a little skeptical of that part. If you were asking the question too about you know what the dream policy would be, you know, and I don't know exactly how to best think about the financing for that. There's other people who spend a whole lifetime thinking about financing issues. But one of the things that I would certainly put out there is I would hope that the policy in terms of its nuts and bolts, because in the end, how well this works is going to be issues also of nuts and bolts, is one where we take advantage of the fact that we do have a robust system of health care in the United States. We have prenatal care centers, and if we're going to get word to parents about what they're entitled to in terms of family leave, prenatal clinics is a great place to do that. And it's a great place for them to start the planning on exactly how they're going to be able to utilize that. That at the end of family leave, there's going to be, for many families, child care needs. And that we need to be engaging also the child care community. And we also need to be engaging child care resource and referral agencies that are basically existing programs that are paid for to do exactly that. And so what I would hope is that the attention isn't only placed on the big issues, but also that there's going to be some good thought in terms of exactly how best to implement this and to roll this out so that we can do this in a way that families can understand what they're entitled to and that they can make best use of it. Because in giving a family access to a service that they need isn't really giving them access if they don't know they have it. And we need to think about exactly how to manage that too.
Well, thank you all so much for your time and your expertise. I know that I learned a lot, and it's always exciting for me to hear, you know, even though we talked a little bit about the politics and the policy, but also to hear about the science and what the research is showing us. So thank you all so much for being here.
Kimberly, thank you for leading us through that. Panelists, thank you for being here. For everybody in the audience that was so generous with their time this morning, thank you for spending so much. This is just the beginning of BPC's process. One thing I'd like to note is that we work across the spectrum on a lot of different issues. Paid family leave doesn't really get headlines. As discussed, it's a silent struggle, and there are a lot of different parts. A lot of the end of this conversation was about the child care and infant side. We'll be exploring the medical side, the family side, and having discussions with public and closed door over the course of the next few months, and we welcome engaging you all over time. So please reach out and let us know if you'd like to be involved, and thank you for being here.